Jan Pieterszoon Coen came back from the Banda Islands and submitted his paperwork. What happened on those islands in 1621 was not a secret. It was not a rogue operation that the Heeren 17 later disavowed or quietly buried. Coen wrote to Amsterdam with the operational specificity of a man who expected his reports to be filed, reviewed, and approved. The correspondence exists. The archive in The Hague holds it. And what those letters show is not a commander who believed he was doing something he needed to hide. He believed he was solving a problem his employers had asked him to solve.
The VOC archive in The Hague contains approximately 25 million pages of documentation. It is the actual physical record of the company's operations across nearly 2 centuries. Every dispatch, every invoice, every set of instructions sent from Amsterdam to the Governor General's office in Batavia. It is the largest surviving corporate archive from the pre-industrial world. And somewhere in those 25 million pages are the letters Coen sent home in 1621, describing what was done, and the letters that came back authorizing the next phase.
Coen landed on the Banda Islands in March 1621. He had under his command Dutch soldiers and Japanese mercenaries. The latter recruited because they were effective fighters with no prior relationship to the islands and no particular reason to hesitate. The operation proceeded across several months. The pre-massacre population of the islands was approximately 15,000 people. The survivors, when the campaign concluded, were estimated in the hundreds. These were not combatants. The Orang Kaya had some fighting capacity, but they were merchants first. Their entire model of authority derived from commercial standing, not military strength. What Coen brought was not a force superior to theirs. It was a force of a category entirely different from anything their system of power had prepared them for. The Orang Kaya, the Orandaise merchant leaders who had formed the island's commercial and political authority for generations, who survived the initial campaign, were not left alone. Coen convened what the Dutch records describe as a trial. The charges were treachery, specifically the death of Admiral Verhoef in 1609, the incident that the VOC had been filing as a grievance for 12 years. The proceedings were brief. The verdict was predetermined. A number of the surviving Orang Kaya were executed. The method was recorded. The Japanese mercenaries who had fought the campaign were ordered to carry out the executions. The Orang Kaya were quartered, killed under the authority of a Dutch legal proceeding by soldiers recruited from a third country using the forms of military justice. The record of the trial and the record of the execution exist in the same archive as the dividend figures. It didn't stop there either. Run's own people had surrendered to the Dutch in 1621, spared the war that hit the rest of Banda. England's claim to the island was a separate, ongoing dispute that had nothing to do with who actually lived there. In July 1622, a runaway resident on Run told the Dutch of an alleged plot to escape and kill the guards. Governor Sonck, the same official who'd presided over the Orang Kaya trial the year before, arrested and interrogated Run's leadership. The confessions grew larger with each round of questioning until Sonck believed he'd uncovered a full conspiracy to retake the islands. On September 12, 1622, all 160 free adult men on Run were executed.
And Banda wasn't a closed chapter after that. The same logic, depopulate the territory, replace the people who wouldn't cooperate, got applied again and again across the wider Maluku Islands for the next 4 decades. Company officials said so themselves. In 1627, one VOC official recommended exterminating the population of Ambon outright and replacing it with converts, and pointed to Banda as the model for how to do it. The wars around Ambon and Saram dragged on into the 1660s. The worst of it was the Great Hoamal War from 1651 to 1656. 5 years of fighting with the explicit VOC objective of turning an entire peninsula into what the company's own records call an eternal wasteland. They succeeded. Hoamal stayed uninhabited for the rest of the company's existence.
15,000 people on 10 islands was not the ceiling. It was the opening move.
A show trial at the end of a massacre to establish formally that what had just happened was justice rather than extermination. The legal performance is almost more disturbing than the violence because it tells you that someone understood there needed to be a record justifying the record.
The 1609 death of Verhoef gave the VOC a genuine grievance. That part wasn't manufactured. What was manufactured was the proportionality, the claim that 12 years of accumulated commercial frustration and the deaths of perhaps 36 Dutch sailors warranted the destruction of 15,000 people and the seizure of the only place on Earth where nutmeg grew naturally. Coen's own letters contained the arithmetic. He did not argue that the violence was regrettable but necessary. He argued that it was efficient.
The financial structure and the killing aren't parallel stories here. They're the same story. 1,800 people in Amsterdam had purchased shares in the VOC at the founding in 1602. Many of them had sold those shares, and other people had bought them, and the chain of ownership had shifted over the 20 years since the company launched. The shareholders of 1621 were not necessarily the shareholders of 1602. What they held was a claim on future earnings, not knowledge of present operations.
The VOC had already shown its shareholders what the company was capable of before 1621. In 1610 and 1612, the company paid out dividends totaling 162.5% of the original share value, 10 years into operation, before the Banda massacre, on the strength of the spice trade alone. Averaged out, that's something like 16% a year in dividends alone, on top of a share that still had its own market value. A shareholder who had invested the 3,000 guilder minimum in 1602 had already received 4,875 guilders back before Coen ever landed on the islands. That history of return is what made the Heiden 17 willing to authorize whatever Coen believed was necessary to protect it. And they received it without visiting the islands, without reading Coen's letters, without knowing, necessarily, that a population of 15,000 had been reduced to several hundred in the course of producing the underlying asset the dividend derived from. The structure the VOC had invented in 1602, the thing that made it revolutionary, the geographic separation of capital from operation, was precisely what allowed that information asymmetry to exist for shareholders. It didn't exist for the board. The Heiden 17 read every one of Coen's reports. They were not separated from the information by distance or ignorance. The board of 17 directors received Coen's operational dispatches, and they did two things. They continued paying dividends, and they reappointed Coen to a second term as Governor General. He left the position briefly, returned to Amsterdam, and was then sent back to Batavia because the board decided the eastern operations still required him specifically. He died there in 1629 of cholera, during a Javanese siege of the city. He was 42 years old. Batavia held. The VOC held. The perken system Coen had designed for the Banda Islands, a plantation scheme in which fixed parcels of land, each containing a set number of nutmeg trees, were assigned to Dutch colonists went into operation almost immediately after the massacre ended. Those colonists, called perkeniers, were given enslaved laborers imported from elsewhere in the archipelago to work the trees. The output went to the VOC at prices the VOC dictated. The perkeniers were not free entrepreneurs. They were franchise operators in a system with one customer and no ability to negotiate. The enslaved workers had even less standing. The records of their origins are fragmentary. They came from Java, from Sulawesi, from various points in the archipelago, seized or purchased through networks the VOC controlled. What the records show with clarity is the accounting. How many workers per perken, what their maintenance cost was, how that cost was deducted from the perkenier's earnings.
What the accounting makes plain is that the VOC had no separate category for this. The costs of enslaved labor appeared in the ledgers with the same bureaucratic neutrality as the cost of ship's provisions or rope. No asterisk, no separate column labeled differently. It was an input. It had a price. It was filed. And filing it that way was itself a decision, not an oversight, not a limitation of the accounting system, a decision about what kind of thing a person was.
The document that survives most completely from the Banda system is the price schedule the VOC imposed on nutmeg. Nutmeg delivered to the VOC purchasing station was bought at a price set by the company. The perkenier had no alternative buyer. The entire point of the enforcement apparatus was to ensure there was no alternative buyer. If a foreign ship appeared and attempted to purchase nutmeg directly, the VOC's naval patrols were authorized to treat it as piracy. The VOC charter granted the company authority to wage war, conclude treaties, and establish legal jurisdiction in the regions it operated. Under that framework, any competitor in the nutmeg trade wasn't a competitor, it was a criminal. Rewind to 1621, the same year as the massacre. There was one more complication Coen had to deal with. Run Island, one small island in the Banda chain, was under English protection while Coen was operating everywhere around it. An Englishman named Nathaniel Corthop had landed there in 1616, declared it an English possession, and held it against Dutch blockade for 4 years with a handful of men and almost no resupply from London. He died the year before the massacre, almost certainly in a Dutch ambush, but the English claim survived him. So you had this situation where Coen had just destroyed the Bandanese population and restructured the islands as a captive supply chain, and there was still this one island, barely a few kilometers long, flying an English flag. The English presence on Run wasn't militarily significant, it was commercially intolerable. A single point where the monopoly did not hold was a demonstration that the monopoly could be broken, and that demonstration was worth more to every buyer in Europe than anything else Coen was trying to suppress.
The resolution took almost 50 years. The Treaty of Breda in 1667 formally settled the competing English and Dutch colonial claims in several theaters simultaneously, North America among them. The English received Dutch recognition of their claim to the former New Netherland colony, which became New York. The Dutch received English recognition of their claim to Run.
Run for Manhattan. The exchange is usually presented as a joke at England's expense that they gave away what became one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in human history for a nutmeg island most people have never heard of. But the valuation at the time was not irrational. In 1667, rum was inside the most profitable controlled commodity system in the world. Manhattan was a cold trading post on the edge of a continent that had not yet proven what it would become.
The people who made that trade were making a rational decision based on known values in 1667, not acting like fools. The thing that makes it look absurd 3.5 centuries later is that the monopoly eventually broke and Manhattan eventually didn't.
The monopoly broke slowly and through botanical rather than military means. The nutmeg tree is not especially difficult to cultivate if you have the right climate and the right soil. The Banda Islands held those conditions in exceptional concentration, but tropical volcanic soils elsewhere were not incompatible with the tree. The VOC understood this vulnerability from the beginning. The enforcement apparatus against seedlings was not paranoia, it was accurate threat assessment. VOC officials poured lime on seedlings in the soil of other islands. Ships were sent to patrol for naturalized nutmeg growth and destroy it. The system worked for the better part of a century and a half.
What broke it was Pierre Poivre, a French botanist. His name translates with almost suspiciously convenient to Peter Pepper, who made it his mission to break the Dutch spice monopoly by transplanting the trees. He worked at it for years, made several attempts to get seedlings out of the Banda chain, and eventually succeeded in the 1770s, establishing nutmeg cultivation on islands in the French colonial Indian Ocean, particularly Mauritius and later Réunion.
The trees grew. The monopoly cracked. It did not collapse immediately. The VOC was already in serious difficulty by the 1770s, for reasons that had as much to do with its own internal structure as with the spice trade. But the botanical breach confirmed that the entire edifice Coen had built at such cost in 1621 had always rested on the assumption that the seedlings could be contained. Once they couldn't, the underlying logic of the enterprise, that you needed the islands to have the nutmeg, was gone.
Grenada today is the world's second largest nutmeg producer. Grenada, a Caribbean island that had nothing to do with nutmeg until the French transplantation project reached the Western Hemisphere. The Dutch massacre of the Bandanese in 1621 produced a monopoly that lasted roughly 150 years, and then was undone by one persistent French botanist and a handful of seedlings.
The long aftermath of the Banda Islands is visible in the islands themselves, in a way that is difficult to look at directly. The current population of the Banda Islands is roughly 20,000 people, larger than the pre-massacre population, but the Bandanese as a distinct people were essentially gone after 1621. The current population descends largely from the enslaved workers imported under the perken system and from the Dutch perkeneers themselves. The culture that had built a multi-buyer trading system over generations, that had negotiated with Arab and Javanese and Portuguese and Spanish merchants, that had understood its geographic leverage and used it deliberately, that culture did not survive. The Indonesian government inherited this in 1945 when independence came. Not just the islands, the entire VOC infrastructure, the administrative systems, the legal frameworks, the physical buildings in Batavia and elsewhere. The Dutch colonial apparatus didn't end cleanly. It was renegotiated over years under considerable duress, and the institutional patterns it had embedded in the archipelago did not simply dissolve when the flag changed. In 2020, King Willem-Alexander issued a formal apology for the violence of the colonial period. The word apology was used, not merely regret. 2 years later, in 2022, Prime Minister Rutte went further, issuing what was described as a full apology on behalf of the Dutch government. The Banda Islands were part of the history being addressed. The distinction between the two statements, a monarch speaking and then a head of government speaking, matters, because only one of them carries the weight of the state in a constitutional sense. A monarch speaking and a government speaking are structurally different things. One carries the weight of history and symbolism, the other carries the weight of accountability and policy.
What neither statement could easily escape was the archive. It is all there, 25 million pages, every letter filed, every price schedule recorded. The documentation that made the VOC efficient also made its history impossible to claim was unknown.
That is the thing Coen's correspondence makes unavoidable. He did not believe he was doing something that needed to be hidden. He believed he was executing a business decision. The dividends of 162.5% paid in 1610 and 1612 before the massacre, on the strength of the spice trade the Banda Islands made possible, were what the Heron 17 were protecting when they authorized Coen's campaign. The Heron 17 understood what those reports said. They had appointed a man who wrote that without a just war, no trade could be maintained, and without trade, no just war. And then they sent him back for a second term. The system was not corrupted by the Banda massacre. The system produced the Banda massacre and then distributed the proceeds.
And the VOC never had to answer for it. Not to the shareholders who collected the dividends, not to anyone with the standing to ask. What it eventually cost was the company itself, and whether the mechanism of that collapse was built into the same structure that made the massacre possible is where this goes next. There is a statue of Coen that stood in his hometown of Hoorn for decades. It became the center of a public debate about removal in exactly the period when the Dutch government was working through what an apology for colonial violence should look like and to whom it should be addressed. The statue is still there, which is its own kind of filing. The VOC held a monopoly enforced by violence and documented with precision for a century and a half. And then, in the span of a single generation, it went from the most valuable commercial enterprise in the world to a bankrupt institution whose debts the Dutch government quietly assumed. The question is whether those two facts are unrelated, or whether the same logic that made the company so powerful made its eventual ruin inevitable.
This is Pulse, Origins, produced by Singularity Pulse Network. Views expressed are our own. New episodes every Sunday. Follow us on @ThePulseSPN on X, the Everything app.
I'm Knox. Every Saturday on Pulse Deep Dive, one story told in acts. This season, how AI happened, who really invented the internet, and going back to the moon 53 years later. New chapter every Saturday. Find it wherever you listen.